Okay, it's 2:05. Hello, everybody. My name is Susan Spronk. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join this webinar. It's a great pleasure to be here with Ruth Felder, Thomas Chiasson-Labelle, and Jeff Weber. We're going to be talking today about crisis, conflict, and state power, contemporary Latin American capitalism. Of course, this is great to have a panel on Latin America at the Historical Materialism Conference, the La Grande Transition in Montreal. As we know, Latin America is a laboratory for many, many things, including a laboratory for what we would call 21st century socialism. And so this panel is going to look at diverse perspectives. And so I will introduce each of the speakers now, and also we'll put it in the chat when each of you starts speaking. I regret to inform you that Kristen Chupa is unable to join us today, but we are going to follow the order of the program, starting with Ruth Felder. And so Ruth is an assistant teaching professor in the political science program in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University. She has done work on the role of the state and state policies in the making of neoliberalism and its crisis in Argentina. She also works on development and precarious labor in Latin America. And Thomas Chiasson-Labelle is guest professor in Department of Sociology and Gender Studies at Flaxo, Ecuador, and also a member of the research cluster Extractivism in Society at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And then last, we're going to hear from Jeff Weber, who teaches in the Department of Politics at York University. And most recently, he's a co-author along with Frank Godichot and Massimo Bonderesi of the forthcoming book, Impasse of the Latin American Left. Each speaker is going to have about 12 minutes to do the presentation. We're hoping to leave lots of time for questions. Thanks in advance as well to Elise, who's with us today as our tech support from the conference, and she's going to help us navigate through the Zoom system. You're going to be able to either use the question and answer feature or the chat. So, Ruth, please take it away.
Thank you, Susan. Nice to see all of you, even if it is through Zoom. So I'm going to talk about the Argentinian frustration notes of the development failure state and state policies. This is a sort of preliminary attempt to make sense of the recent right turn in Argentina, which starts with what happened during the pink tide of the 2000s. Well, the pink tide brought about debates about development and development strategies and the role of the state in development to the fore. And this made a lot of sense because the policies that took distance from neoliberal blueprint in the 2000s were initially instrumental in fueling growth, improving the well-being of many people in Latin America. But by the late 2000s, these policies gradually became less effective as the balances of forces that had made the pink tide, sorry, Susan, is there any?
No, sorry, I was just posting your sorry.
Okay. The policies that the conditions that had made the pink tide possible, the policies became less, the pink tide policies became less effective as the balances of forces that had made the pink tide and its policies possible were changing. By the mid-2010s, right-wing governments were coming to power in the region with the promise of putting an end to the pink tides, alleged policy mismanagement. And shortly after this, right-wing tide was which was expected to produce major structural transformations in the economies and polities of the region, became also trapped in various crises. So this trajectory requires as to situate both the left turn of the 2000s and the more recent right turn in the broader context of the factors that account for success and failure of development strategies and the forms of state action associated with them. So before presenting a very brief account of the history of the decline of the pink tide and the right-wing government led by Mauricio Macri in Argentina, I want to refer to some assumptions about the role of the state that prevailed during the period and to some extent were common to the pink tide and the subsequent right-wing governments, at least in the case of Argentina. That is the idea that the state has a role in leading processes of development by implementing policies that improve the competitiveness of the domestic economy in a context of intense global competition. The state is expected to be engaging in relations of cooperation with business with the purpose of aligning their actions with its own strategic goals, and it is also expected to be able to improve domestic competitiveness regardless of the initial position of the country. And underlying this, there is some overstatement of the capacities of the state and a neglect of the limitations to its action in seizing the benefits of global competition. In other words, development revolves around the will of the state, but this will remains unexplained. So to move beyond these, class balances had to be brought back to the analysis of state policies. In the case of Argentina, in the early 2000s, the country went from the crisis of neoliberal reforms and acute social conflict of 2001 to a recovery which included major policy shifts away from neoliberalism, robust growth, and the recovery of the legitimacy of the state, which has been seriously damaged during the previous crisis. But the very factors that account for this stage of growth and consensus created the conditions for its decline. Growth and significant improvement in social indicators led to a decline in social mobilization, and the political capacity of the capitalist fractions leading growth, including their capacity to veto policies, gradually strengthened during the mid-2000s. And in the context of the worsening international context of the late 2000s, growth started to slow down. Macroeconomic instability became compounded with growing fiscal and external imbalances, and the state became increasingly unable to satisfy demands from both capital fractions and workers, and to create better conditions for attracting investments and resuming growth. In this context, the political opposition from the right was consolidating on arguments about the need to leave populism behind, and under the leadership of Mauricio Macri, this opposition won the election in 2015. The new government took pains to make the country trustworthy for business by eliminating regulations, settling open conflict with sovereign creditors, to resume sovereign borrowing, among other decisions. However, the return of some of the neoliberal policy repertoire, of the combination of some neoliberal policy repertoire with the context inherited from the pink tide government, failed to deliver the expected results. Inflation accelerated, foreign direct investments never materialized, and the level of Argentinian sovereign debt became unsustainable by 2018. And also the government plans to leave populism behind, which was central to the agenda of the right that came to power in the last years, by limiting the capacity of the working class to mobilize and place demands onto the state, failed. By late 2017, shortly after a remarkably good performance for the government coalition in the midterm election, it attempted to make progress in the agenda of structural reforms, and this attempt was blocked by intense social mobilization, especially the attempt to restructure the pension system and open the door for a future reprivatization of the previously nationalized pension system is a clear example of this. Even if Congress did pass this reform, it turned to be a major political defeat for the government. Yet, growing protests and struggles did not reverse the exacerbation of the regressive distribution of wealth, and gradually struggles turned into electoral constructions and disputes around Macri's bid for re-election. In late 2019, a broad coalition led by Alberto Fernandez and former President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner defeated Macri and took power with a new iteration of the pink tide agenda, although this time with more business-friendly tone. Then the COVID-19 pandemic altered its policy priorities and raised new questions about the capacity of the state to overcome the crisis and recreate conditions for capital accumulation in an extremely difficult economic, political, and social conflict. So the analysis of the Argentinian case shows that the action of the state has been shaped by specific historical, political, and ideological conjunctures of social mobilization, decline of mobilization, and contestation over development strategies beyond the political leanings of governments. In the 2000s, the pink tide agenda helped to institutionalize struggles against neoliberalism and transform them into policies. But this institutionalization faced the structural limits in the context of changes in the balances of forces catalyzed by growth. The centrality of the state and state policies that had been effective during the virtuous stage of the pink tide became politically problematic, as the failure to maintain conditions for growth with social inclusion, as it was announced, was seen as the direct responsibility of the state. Likewise, the attempt to resume growth through the creation of more attractive conditions for investors through liberalization, led by Macri, also failed to resume growth because it rapidly met the political limits to intensify a regressive distribution of wealth and create the political conditions to make the country attractive for investments. So, and this calls attention to the illusions that the state can lead processes of social transformation in the absence of capacities to organize and struggle apart from the state and over the state, and it also on both sides of the class divide. So some of the challenges to the neoliberal blueprint developed in the context of the crisis and the struggles against the consequences of neoliberal reform. Some of these developed in this context of struggles against the consequences of neoliberal reforms of the early 2000s. But then the decline of struggles to some extent explains the very limitations of the pink tide governments. I mean, the the conditions that account for the success of the pink-tide government in the mid-2000s also explains the limitations of this government, and similarly explains the electoral success of right-wing government, actually for the first time in the history of the country, and also the limitations of this right-wing government to advance an agenda of liberalization and reintegration with the global economy. So, and this is in turn warning against the illusion that governments will lead processes of social transformation in the absence of social forces able to making this change possible. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Ruth. And also great timing, around 12, 13 minutes. Thank you very much. So the next up is Toma.
Hello, can you properly hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I prepared a little PowerPoint presentation. I'm not sure if it's the right decision in the context, but I'll do it anyway. I think sometimes it also helps to have some images that accompany the speech, especially in webinars. So now let me know if you can see the slides.
Yeah, we can see it. Thanks.
And that actually is the last one, so I'm going a bit fast. Okay, so if you can see them, my presentation I titled it "Basta con el extractivismo," or "Enough with extractivism: the reality and the concept." And I'm going to first, it's a work in progress, and I'm going to flesh out a bit the process that I'm going through so that you can see the kind of reflections that I want to offer with that piece of research. The point of departure for that research was actually, I was in a meeting of the Claxo conference in 2018 in Buenos Aires. So it really dovetails well with what Ruth was just discussing. And so I was at the Claxo conference, and I heard a conference talk by Saskia Sassin. And she was using the concept of extractivism to discuss how bankers had predatory behaviors during and after the 2008 crisis in the US, and then was extending the use of the concept of extractivism to discuss the relationship between bankers and students who contract loans to pursue their studies. And I was kind of then puzzled about this use of the concept of extractivism that I had never heard. And then all of a sudden I started looking around for other uses. And then I found that what I always thought was the norm of the concept when I was doing Latin American studies was extractivism as this share of the economy that is related to mining and hydrocarbon extraction, and eventually extended to certain form of agriculture for export, was eventually used for much more other things. And then I found an article by Veronica Gago and Sandro Mesadra in 2017, where extractivism was used to describe operation from territorial to digital extractivism. Digital extractivism being some people that are playing video games and in order to earn rewards, and there's some gist there, and or financial extractivism as well. And then I could not but think about an article written by Cardoso in 1977, where that's titled "The Consumption of Dependency Theory in the United States," where he was saying there is a ritualization of concept in certain fields of study, where all of a sudden one concept gets used to describe everything, and slowly it describes less and less. And that was his claim about dependency in 1977, saying that it describes so many things that we lose the debates and what it was trying to say originally. And then I was wondering if actually this wasn't the same for the concept of extractivism. Isn't there something to be said that is specific to the sector, or as being the mining and hydrocarbon extraction, or is it extraction just another word for capitalism? So in order to reflect about what made the extractive sector specific, so of course, we could say that in broad and general terms that there is an environmental impact that is can be seen as specific to the concept. But I wanted to move somewhere else there and try and think about what makes it specific in the terms of the power relationship it allows you to establish. And the power relationship, because obviously from a Marxist political economic background, the concept in political economy are there to flesh out, to illustrate relationships of powers. So relationships of power. So that's why I was trying to think about rent, which is one of the specific category that would apply to extractivism in that context. So then what I attempted to do is going through several Latin American authors who wrote about rent and its political economy to understand what were the specificities in the debate in Latin America, and how was there something specific to understand about the power relationship related to the extractive sector. And then, so what you see here is a chart where I put on the left column the main definition of what rent is, or the different forms that rent is taking in the Marxist literature, and then its translation on how it creates value, the power relationship it describes, and then eventually how it applies or translates with the extractivism as mining or hydrocarbon extraction sector. So differential rent number one, I'm going to go a bit fast here. It's a heavy theoretical consideration, but I don't want to describe them all. I'm just going to go fast. But it's if you have a better land, it produces better yields. Therefore, you will get a specific rent as the owner of this land. So this describes our relationship where the luckier landlords has power over other landlords. And this actually translates pretty well if we think about extractivism as mining and hydrocarbon, because there are some oil fields that are much easier to extract oil from than others, and therefore it does give some power relationship of different nature there. Then there is differential rent number two. Unequal capitals applied to equal lands produce more. So this is if you invest more in certain lands, you can have better yields. This is also the technologies of extraction would apply as well, but it's essentially the competition between farmers, and therefore here we would have the competition between people, between multinational corporations in the extractive sector. There is then but those two types of rents are much less specific, because actually it's the competitive productive side of production in any side. But then what makes the reflection a bit more complex is all the reflection about absolute rent, which is the rent that is not derived from the differential capacity of a land to produce, but that is the specificity of the rent that you take out in agriculture that does not correspond to other other branches of production. And this is where the debate becomes the most interesting in terms of what I am reflecting about now, because there is actually a debate about the definition of absolute and monopoly rent. And in very short term, the absolute rent would be the rent that is derived according to Inigo Carrera, but it's debated with Dussel, as the lower organic composition of capital in the agricultural branch. This would mean that since there's less machinery and more labor, there's more space to extract value. Therefore, you can generate rent, and this rent accrue to the landlord. But this absolute rent is more or less true in the case of the extractive sector, because actually extraction generally use very high and heavy technologies and very low labor. Therefore, the organic composition of capital wouldn't be corresponding here. But then there is the thing that I think is the most important for the reflection here is all the question about monopoly rent. And the monopoly rent is the rent that is derived from the capacity of the landlord class as a class to dictate its terms over other classes. And there is, for one, what it can do with respect to the agricultural worker, and there is the monopoly rent as in relationship to, is it 2 minutes that I have left? I see Susan raising a paper. Okay, so the monopoly rent is the monopoly rent. There is the capacity of the class to impose, or so to expulse peasants from communal lands in this case. And then there is the other version of the monopoly rent is the determination of what the land is producing. So all this is to say that really what comes out from this reflection on rent is that the relationship to the extractive sector that becomes different is in the capacity of determining the ownership and the power relationship that is derived from property that becomes interesting. And then, so what I did here, and I'm going to go a bit fast here, is to flesh out some of the characteristic of the mining and hydrocarbon sector that makes it different from other sector of production and that are worth therefore considering as a factor that helps us to understand how the balance of power was shifting around the extractive sector. So first of all, as opposed to other sector, it's non-renewable. And if the fact that it's non-renewable becomes very important because it allows the possibility to suspend production and not suspend the rent, but just defer rent. This is something important because if somebody working the land stops producing 1 year to increase the price, you won't get the rent that year, but you will not recuperate the rent the next year. Whereas if you don't extract from a mine and the price increase, then you extract the next year and you can always get all the rent that is laying down there because of its non-renewable character. Then there is also the fact that the production is unmovable. The resource is either there or not. Therefore, it restricts mobility, and that gives a greater ease to generate this monopoly power that is linked to the monopoly rent. Then there is the tendency to exhaust the territory it uses, the tendency to be exploited by multinational corporations as opposed to domestic elite, and then it's transformed and traded internationally. These are some of the specificities of the extractive sector. And then what I do with this theoretical conversation about rent is to apply it to the study of very specific elite and state and government conflicts, and to see how it plays out, how the power relationship and how elites are claiming certain rights, rights over rent, over other sources of wealth, and in order to understand how rent plays out in those conflicts and how it shows what are the limits of the state capacity to change things using rent. And there I really I'm bridging the conclusion that were raised by Ruth in her paper, because I study part of an Argentinian conflict, but also because what we see is that the rent plays different roles in different places, but essentially what I'm trying to get at with all this comparison, because I'm comparing Venezuela, the conflict, and the coup d'etat from 1999 and 2003, where you had actually a nationalization of the resources. In Bolivia, the 2006 and 2010, where you had a recuperation also of a greater rent from the underground. So I am here distinguishing what is related to underground rent as opposed to the ground rent. Then in Argentina, you had a very different, an important conflict in 2008, where actually it's the attempt to capture a greater ground rent that led to a conflict with agricultural elite. And actually what we see is that when in the study of those four conflicts, what I noticed is that it was very hard for elites to, governments of the so-called pink tide or post-neoliberal governments to actually extract something from their domestic elites. So to get a share of ground rent, to tax more the profits of their domestic elites, but it was way easier to tax the underground rent. And there is the gist of the reflection that I'm trying to produce here, is that there is something specific about the underground rent. It was much easier to establish a state monopoly over underground rent. So the monopoly power that is related to the monopoly rent was much easier to use, and it tended to separate the elites from that are living from the extraction of resources that are mostly international from other sectors. And international elites in the extractive sector have less political leverage and mobilization capacity inside of the country. So therefore, it defines really different power relationships. And that's probably why the post-neoliberal governments were able to capture underground rent much easier than other sectors. Therefore, my theoretical conclusion that, of course, it is true that to a certain level of abstraction, extractivism is central to the capitalist world system and therefore cannot be separated from its overall dynamics. Capitalism will always need resources. So therefore, to a certain extent, the separation is always a theoretical separation. But at the lower level of abstraction, what I am showing is that the extractive sector, as understood as the specific sector dedicated to mining and hydrocarbon extraction, does entail specific power relationships that are derived from a specific particular form of value distribution. And it offered to the pink tide the possibility of temporal quick fix without really altering the relationship with domestic elite. And so we have there something that is worth preserving as something that helps us understand a certain characteristic of the failure, if we want, of the pink tide, the post-neoliberal government. And so that's why I'm then saying maybe by using extractivism to discuss a lot of other things, we are overstretching the concept. And I cannot see the chat, so I'm not sure if I'm over my time, but I'm done. So voila.
Great. Thank you, Tama. I apologize for moving my paper. I was watching your presentation, not my camera. So you were doing good. Thank you. Next is Jeff Weber. I'm going to put his, can you see the chat? I'm just wondering if it's working, actually. I just put Jeff's
yeah,
bio.
I can see it.
You can see it? Cool, thanks.
Oh, I don't see what you put in the chat.
No. Oh, no? Okay, which means that I don't have access to my chat. Well, I'll fix that, hopefully, while you go ahead, Jeff.
Okay. Thanks, Susan. So mine follows on the first two presentations with a very general and overly schematic survey of 5 strategic questions, I think, raised by the left in Latin America, broadly conceived, between the late 1990s and the present, okay? And so given that I have 12 minutes, I'm gonna say very little about each of these 5, but I'm flagging them as the key pivots of strategic debate as I see it. So up until the late 1990s, I think these strategic points were less important because there was both a weaker left and a left that had been annihilated from both physically from bureaucratic authoritarianism in the Southern Cone and counterinsurgency in Central America, and restructured in terms of neoliberal economic policies and transformations of class structures and decomposition of old class forms, and ideologically from the sort of seeming impossibility of socialism by the 1990s. And so in that condition of the early 90s, the left, in its broad sense, shared a certain commonality in its basic critique of neoliberalism. But as we progress, as a sign of its growing strength and complexity, these divisions within the left start to emerge and take on important concrete expressions. So to begin then with just a survey in 2 minutes of the basic periods that I'm looking at. In the late 1990s, economically, what's important is that there's a major economic downturn, a major recession that lasts 4 years throughout South America in particular. Central America, the Caribbean and Mexico are a different story because of their differential integration into the U.S. market. But in South America, a very, very deep recession, the worst recession on aggregate terms since the early 80s debt crisis. And out of that, there was a recomposition of the left, not mechanically linked to this economic crisis, but certainly related, different temporalities and so on, but a social extra-parliamentary left starts to articulate itself in different kinds of movements. And this kind of movementist rearticulation of a certain kind of anti-neoliberal left, and in certain countries, particularly in Bolivia, with a layer of anti-capitalist critique, an important layer of anti-capitalist critique going beyond a mere anti-neoliberalism. That kind of movementist left persists as dominant until around 2003, 2004, when and through the mid 2000s, when first of all, economically, capitalist dynamism renews to the region through, not least through the massive industrialization of China and the acceleration of commodity prices linked to what Thomas was saying in terms of extractivism. But this corresponds with a kind of move from movementism to a center-left, dominant center-left entry into electoral success, so the takeover of administrations and some further left administrations, or at least self-described in those terms. So a whole variety of lefts, but at least on their own terms, they come to office, so that the whole electoral map of South America changes over this period with very few exceptions, although those exceptions are important. This then connects to the third moment when you have the decline of that commodity boom, the decline of that commodity cycle. And again, not mechanically, but I'm making it sound mechanical because I'm trying to get through this. Depending on the driving commodity of the period, the prices start to fall as early as 2011, sometimes as late as 2014 in the case of oil, after a brief dip in oil in 2009 with the global crisis. But basically the reverberation of the global crisis coming into South America in uneven ways has an impact on the declining plausibility of these center-left possibilities, and you start to see major crises of those, and you start to see the renewal of right-wing administrations. And then more recently, there's been a new cycle of very uneven emergence of new popular explosions, not least in Ecuador in 2019, in Chile in 2019, in Colombia as we speak, and so on. Okay, so through all of that, different strategic questions, I think, have taken precedence at different moments. So the first two terms are the sort of false dichotomy, I think, between what can be called autonomism and constitutionalism, with autonomous emphasizing the kind of self-organization, assembly-style democratic forms, horizontalism, emphasizing spontaneity, emphasizing anti-power, with a skepticism of politics, which was far-reaching, a skepticism of politics also in organized left forms. So a skepticism of formal trade unions, a skepticism of formal left parties, in addition to a skepticism of the right. And I think this could emerge at a very abstract level in the debates of Antonio Negri and Michael Hart and John Holloway and so on, but more concretely in the kind of more politicist writings of someone like Raul Cepecci on the Argentine context. Okay, this kind of emphasis has a strong prevalence in the early 2000s. And is associated by Cepecci. I'm not saying that he's right, but he's associating this with the Zapatistas, with the popular assemblies and piqueteros in Argentina, with the MST in Brazil, and so on. That kind of attraction starts to recede precisely as the center-left comes into the second wave, beginning with these elections and so on. And that's where most of the left turns away from autonomy and I think abandon some of the insights of autonomy into a relatively uncritical embrace of the new center-left and left administrations. Of course, I'm not naming them in all the particularities because I don't have time, but we can talk about it in the discussion. The other is constitutionalism, which was the opposite of autonomy. It was this slow build up through mayoral campaigns, to governor campaigns, to national government campaigns that characterized the PT in Brazil after its early days, and extreme electoralism in the sense of a full capitulation to whatever was necessary to win elections. Also in the Frente Amplio, the Broad Front in Uruguay is another, it typifies this kind of trend. And so if the problem of autonomy was that they thought elections were to be avoided on all counts, the problem with constitutionalism was that they thought power actually resided in electoral forms and the existing parliamentary and bourgeois institutions of the state. This relates to a second antinomy, which was movement and party, which was the notion that on the one side, well, I won't say the debates, I'll just say what I think about movements and parties. These are movements and parties are to be considered complementary, but playing different forms, okay? Movements articulate in our laboratories of learning and expression and self-organization and consciousness raising at an immediate level, at a level of relative spontaneity, but even here you have organizational forms that movements require to grow. But there are limits, and there are problems with the movementist view as kind of solving the problem, because they can't on its own, because they can't think of problems of retreat, of decomposition, of fragmentation. Those moments when you are not moving from movement victory to aggregation to building, but in movements of falling back and so on, and the danger there of fragmentation and movement back to capitalist normality. So in the Argentinian example, 2003, Kirchner's rise to office is an example of the limits of that earlier moment of assemblies of piqueteros and so on and so forth, with the restoration of capitalist normality. Now, parties, on the other hand, obviously party can take, it depends very much what kind of party you're talking about, but parties are the necessary forms to articulate a longer continuity of consciousness raising, including in those periods of downturn of activity, right? Relative downturn and decomposition. An effort to maintain a socialist solidarity and to build consciousness beyond the immediate demands, to connect immediate demands with more transformative aims. And I think these were crucial questions that were beginning to be raised in the early 2000s, but which were then set aside in some ways by the center-left and renewal capitalist of dynamism in the 2003 to 2011, 2014 period. The other question is the social subject that was raised in all kinds of ways, but I'll just point to one. So what is the revolutionary subject, or for others, what is the reformist subject? And the subject historically, both for reform and for revolution, was, at least in classical Marxist terms, was the working class. Now, the working class conceived in many different ways, but for someone like René Rojas, for example, writing in Catalyst in an influential piece, he reads the decomposition of the formal working class, unionized working class, into an informal, fragmented labor market as structurally inhibiting the possibilities of the pink tide from the outset. And so anyone who expected the pink tide to go somewhere deeper is a voluntarist, including myself, because there were these structural limits on that, right? It's a very sophisticated defense of this position, even if I disagree with it. Now, the problem there, of course, is not that I want to retain the idea that there is a special strategic importance for strategically located workers, but that the composition of class struggle and the revolutionary subject is necessarily diverse, right? Particularly in the differentiated, massively differentiated social formations in Latin America. So one cannot understand what's happening in Chile today in an expression of electoralism. And I'll wrap up without finishing my last point, because I'm at 12 minutes. But I just interrupted myself and lost my train of thought. All right, so the Chile, the recent the 4-part elections of mayoral mayoral, city councils, regional governors, and the constituent convention that just happened. Many people are really emphasizing that this is completely, it is very important, but it's completely incomprehensible without October 2019, right? And October 2019 is incomprehensible if you take the view that you need structurally a organized, a high density of unions before you can do anything, right? Chile is massively unorganized in terms of its union density from what it once was. And there are major limits to what October 2019 was, but it created the conditions potentially to undermine the neoliberal constitution from the dictatorship. And the Constituent Convention would never have happened without it, right? So we need to have a much more flexible view of what the diversity of subjects might be and the kind of temporalities of change and how to assess them. My actual final point is populism. I won't say what it is. It's a very controversial term, but I'll just say that populism, I think, I do think we need to talk about it, and I think that it is the most important way in which the revolutionary left has been defeated in the efforts to exit crises of capitalism in a progressive way. Okay, so since the 1930s and forward, populism has been the exit that has circumscribed the capacities of the revolutionary left to advance rather than a solution, because some of the response by the left today in Latin America is, I think, in responding to the right-wing critique of classical left populism and its different more recent iterations in the pink tide, is responding kind of mechanically in a defense of left populism without understanding that the limits of left populism under the pink tide set the conditions for the return of the far right. And so we can't merely return to the coalitions of the pink tide in order to salvage that experiment. Okay, thanks.
All right, fantastic. So while people are collecting their thoughts, we do have one question in the chat that I'll just have the panelists just read for themselves, and I'll direct you in a minute. Jeff, you addressed it in part, I think, at the end, second part of end of your. But we have 3 papers. Ruth's paper went over different moments in history in Argentina. I think Ruth's paper and Jeff's paper really speak to each other quite clearly in terms of these cycles of mobilization, the limits on the state in terms of its ability to achieve reformist reforms or revolutionary reforms or whatever terminology we'd like to use. But what it really underscores for me is something that Comrade David Camfield from the New Socialists put once to me as, when we win elections, we're not winning power, we're winning office. And to always keep that distinction in mind, because achieving anything in the context of a capitalist state requires some semblance of negotiation. And I think what Ruth's and Jeff's paper really highlight is the importance of the disruptive capacity of the working classes to actually push for transformative change of any sort. Thomas's paper is very theoretically rich contribution as well that looks more specifically at 4 different cases. And there's a distinction there between ground rent and underground rent that I think speaks to the debates that are going on in terms of what it means for the class formations in Latin America and the kind of limits. And I actually would probably invite some questions. I think there's subtle differences there that you're really trying to unpack that have political importance about ground rent versus underground rent. And the first question that comes to mind from me, Thomas, is like, doesn't it have a lot to do with international commodity prices in terms of mine and hydrocarbons versus what does ground rent produce in terms of that tradable commodity? Does that have anything to do with the schema that you've laid out? But why don't we start with the first question that was put in the chat, and I will invite the speakers, as I told you, in reverse order to answer the questions in the chat. And again, you can take a pass if you don't feel like you're wanting to answer, but the first question we got is from Peter. Thanks to Peter, and he says, a question for any of you all. How do you see the current win of a very anti-capitalist left, unlike previous social democratic forces in Chile, which will be in charge of forming the new constitution and running the country. A communist will be mayor of Santiago, for example, as it relates to current capitalism and the promotion of social movements in South America, Latin America. So we're seeing Chile coming to the game in terms of these kind of dynamics we've seen elsewhere in Latin America in the last 20 years, actually. So why don't we start with Jeff, and then it will be Thomas, and then Ruth, and then when we get another question or a round of questions, we'll do the other order. Jeff.
Okay, thanks. So I think, I think we should pause to celebrate the moment, and without being delusional about the moment, right? That we should do these two things at once. The thing to celebrate, which is extremely important, is the possibility, although it's only a possibility, that through the convention as it is constituted, the constitution of 41 years ago under Pinochet will be defeated, right? That would be an enormous achievement, but it's only a possibility. I think there's things to say about those elections, and I'll only focus on the constituent convention, not on the different mayoral races, governor races, because that would take a long time. But the critical thing is that first thing to note in terms of the positive is that the agglomerated list of the Communist Party and the Frente Amplio won the most seats on what could be called the very broad left, right? And that part, the Communist Party and the Frente Amplio, with 28 seats out of 155 in the convention, was extremely important because these were the parties most closely affiliated with the renewal of social struggle going back to, especially since 2011, with the student movements and then the massive wave of wider movements that built into October 2019, and particularly the role of popular feminism in its renewal is critically important. Compared to 25% for the Concertación coalition, which was the social liberal left. I mean, it's difficult to call it left, but this is how they conceived of themselves. And within that, even the Christian Democrats, the most right wing of the Concertación coalition, only got 2 seats compared to 15 with the Socialist Party and so on. So that coalition, so together they constitute about a third of the convention, which gives them a veto power on all articles going through. It doesn't give them a positive power of just declaring things. But and so the right, which expected to win in all the polling and so on, expected to win enough to overcome at least a third on its own, the combined right and extreme right in Chile Vamos, and they only won 37 seats, despite their unity compared to a divided left. Okay, but the most important feature of this, that's the basic dynamics. But the most extraordinary block is independence, right? Which is an expression of the character of October 2019, because you have 48 seats who are independents. They're not aligned with any of the parties, and they range from massive conservatives. A few of them are crazy in that sense, far right people, but mainly they're at least some kind of anti-authoritarianism, anti-neoliberalism, and with particularly representatives of popular feminism and the women's strike who ran independently, gaining important seats. So final point is that so that's the formal dynamic, but the most alarming and expressive thing which has been underplayed is abstentionism, with a massive abstention. 61.4% of the electorate didn't participate in the elections. And so the idea that this is simply an expression of a movement into the institutions, I think political institutions in general, parties on the left and right, which had very little to do with October 2019, still are massively mistrusted by Chilean society. So I think it's very open what will happen, more open than is captured in a mere celebration. But the defeat of the right is to be celebrated. Sorry for taking too long.
Always. So Tama, you're going to be next, and we've had another question pop up. I don't know if you've been able to see it, but there's one about Chile and there's also one about Ecuador. So please feel free to intervene on either of those, because we are going to be rather stuck for time because we have about 15 minutes. So if we're going to have a second round, we'll have to keep it short.
Okay, so I'll start by answering to your first question. We divide the underground rent from ground rent, and this is I won't show it again, but the fifth slide that I show is what are the specific characteristics of the non-renewable character. The production is unmovable, and all those elements, the tendency to exhaust the territory it uses, define specific characteristic of the underground rent that make it very much subject to being to produce monopoly rent. It's easy by a stroke of a pen for the state to determine that all underground resources belong to the state and then claim resources. And what we have seen actually is that multinational corporations that we often see as the ones who run the show in Latin America, actually they were pretty weak in front of those decisions by the state, because those decisions were based on the assertion of private property, which is at the base of their whole existence. Therefore, they need the state to declare private property, and if the state declares the private property differently, it becomes all of a sudden extremely weak on this term. Nevertheless, this underground rent that the state could claim very quickly was good to accumulate foreign currency, but was absolutely devoid of any capacity to enlist or to discipline the local elites. And that's where it hit a wall. And that's where I think I'm very complimentary to the presentation that Jeff and Ruth have made, in that it was not exactly a political weapon to face the local elite. And that's why I'm comparing those different conflicts. So just to use your question to clarify where this whole paper is kind of going, that's why I think extractivism is interesting for this power relationship it reveals as well. This differential power relationship between international elites. So the only very parenthesis that I would make to Chile is that Chile is very specific in Latin America in that it does have an extractive domestic elite, which most other countries don't. And it also, this I think defines also specific forms of exerting power from domestic capitalist classes that also helps us understand how come they were so powerful in a country where there is a capacity of resistance that had been tamed for so long. So I think that should be also taken into account. About Ecuador, I'll be very brief, because I think the scenario is really open. What we've seen with the moves that have been done in the National Assembly at the end of last week with the switching alliance of Guillermo Lasso breaking his promise to Social Cristiano, indicates that there is some movement happening there that should keep us from being too broad in our projection of what is coming in. What I think was an attempt by the movement, the CONAIE, in alliance with Pachakutik, with all their tension and differences, because they're not one and the same. They have their moments of alliances and their moments of tensions. What was their attempt is to break the main pole of polarization that was monopolizing the political scenario, which is correísmo versus anti-correísmo. So this is what was kind of ruling politics and allowed Lenin Moreno to maintain himself in power as surfing on this kind of dynamic. And this is also why Guillermo Lasso was becoming attractive as the representative of all the people who were critical of Correa. That meant that in this battle, the indigenous movement and the political party affiliated to it were really in a bad position. So they needed to try and break this to make an opening where the division would become much more between neoliberalism and anti-neoliberalism. And this meant also trying to push and go against the Correa. Now what we see is the attempt of Lasso to build up back on this old correísmo, anti-correísmo, to maintain himself and create a governing coalition, because what he sees is also that in the National Assembly, the main force was the correísta, with which, if he was making an alliance, would break also the scheme that led him to power. So I think this this attempt at shifting the axis of political polarization is one way of reading the situation that is also helpful. So we'll see how if the indigenous movement will be able to reclaim the leadership in the anti-neoliberal critique and attract the correísta that are extremely frustrated with what happened. But I'm going to stop here because I see that Susan is raising her eyebrows.
Am I? Because I'm listening. Anyway, Ruth, so there's a lot on the table here. A question on Chile, question on Ecuador. Anything else you would like to address? And then if there are no other questions coming from the chat, I'll also open a space for the panelists to pose questions to each other. So Ruth.
Okay. Yeah, I also celebrate the results of recent elections in Chile, especially because of the long history of Chile and the shadow of Pinochet in Chilean politics for so long. But I'm not sure of the strength of the revolutionary left. I do recognize that this we cannot understand the result of the recent elections without looking at the recent history of social mobilization, of articulation of different struggles. Yet, I think that the rejection of the rejection and the frustration with conventional political forces, and the frustration with the situation, with the absent, the unmet demands, and even the forms of political action of many of the social actors that are part of this change in Chile. I'm not entirely sure, and I probably start talking with Jeff. I'm not sure that this force actually transcend the boundaries of populism, even if their forms of action and they are their forms of intense mobilization and the forms of action seem to be very radical. I'm not sure that any body in Latin American left has, or any meaningful actor in Latin American movements or left, or whatever we want to call social forces, actually has been actually moving beyond the boundaries of populism and some forms of redistribution and some forms of recognition of rights. And closely related with this, I'm not sure about the possibilities of relocation of the Latin American economies in the global economy that is very different from the intense extraction of natural resources for export as a way to somehow sustain some level of redistribution. And also related with this, I do think that the limits of populism explain the rise of the right, but mostly because of their inability to transcend the limits to capital accumulation in the region, rather than their inability to meet and satisfy social demands, or that or social demands to move beyond these forms of very moderate distribution of wealth or massive social policies. If I look at the case of Argentina, I mean, the rise of the right, which is still extremely powerful, even if Mauricio Macri lost the election, and it is shaping political agendas, and it has been able to mobilize in a way that other that left forces haven't recently. I mean, I still see that there is clearly articulated agenda of demands that attack the so-called, I mean, the Kirchner's or populism or the pink tide, not for their limitations, but for their attempts to somehow implement some more audacious policies. So yeah, I'm not particularly optimistic about the immediate future.
Thank you. So we do have one more question, and I'm going to challenge the panelists to what I'm going to call a lightning round, which means you get a minute to answer it because we only have 5 minutes. So I'll paraphrase. The question is about the experience of the center-left Morena party in Mexico, a new one, and the AMLO president in Mexico, relatively autonomous movements, Zapatistas, largely indigenous national council, movements for the protection of territories, and feminist movements that challenge power. What do you think of this experience? So this speaks to what you've all been talking about what is the relationship between autonomistas, constitutionalistas? So let's go in reverse order. So that's going to be Ruth, Tom, or sorry, the order of the presentation, Ruth, Tom, and Jeff. And then I think that we'll have to wrap up.
Mm-hmm.
You can pass.
Well, I don't really have an answer, but I just want to say that, I mean, I think the tension between autonomies and social movements and attempts of democratizing social life, and at the same time recognize the need of fighting for power and the importance of state power has been unresolved, and has not been resolved in the decade of the pink tide, and has not been resolved in the right turn in the countries which underwent a right turn recently. And yeah, so
great. Thanks. Thomas.
When I know I won't speak directly to the case of Mexico, but one of the rare places where there's been a real resistance to the rise of the right is in Bolivia, where I think you, amongst the post-neoliberal experiences, you had one of the most organic relationship between movement and party, although with all its limitation and all its tensions and so on and so forth. The other example is maybe Brazil, but in this case, they really needed a coup, parliamentary coup in order, and a judicial lawfare in order to prevent the left of staying in power. So I think of course it's not resolved. Movement autonomy remains extremely important. The existence of a strong party that is also has some linkages, but is not dictating what the movements are doing in all this range of reflection, defines the limits of the ballpark, I guess.
Great, thank you. Jeff.
Okay, so on the question of populism, which I'll link in the end to AMLO, but just to also respond to some of the things that Ruth and Tomas were saying, I agree with Ruth that the main limit of populism in the most recent round was, the limits, as you said, to overcome the problems of capital accumulation in the region. And I also agree that there was no part of the left which was beyond populism in different iterations. I don't mean that of the social left, but in terms of the lefts that came to office were different iterations of populism, with the possible exception of Brazil being a kind of more social liberal institutionalized party. But I do think that there was that this was, I would read this maybe less fatalistically in terms of in Bolivia, or that there was a variation between different places in terms of what might have happened differently. And in Bolivia, there was a possibility, a moment beyond populism prior to the election of the mass. And so the mass was, and here I think disagree somewhat with Thomas as well in terms of emphasizing the organic relationship. I think the relationship of the mass was one of predominantly pacification and restoration. It was full of contradictions for the first administration up to the Constituent Assembly, but after that you see disarticulation, and you can't understand the coup d'etat of 2019, which we absolutely need to reject, even if we have criticisms of the mass, but without the limits of the mass. I think the mass created the conditions for, I'm not blaming the mass for the coup, but I'm saying that in order to understand the coup, just as in Brazil in 2016, you needed conditions for the implausibility of populism in that moment, and that connects in my last point to AMLO and the Zapatistas, in the sense that I think, to put it to caricature both of them, which is probably what I've been doing the entire time because of the necessity of moving rapidly. The Zapatistas, I mean, the limit of them was precisely that they were isolated to one state, always in a defensive condition, however inspirational they were, and I take them to have been inspirational. I don't think we should fetishize the autonomy of the Zapatistas. The autonomy was also a limit of what they were facing, the strategic possibilities of what they were the strategic questions that posed for them, in the sense that they didn't have an option of state power and then reject it, is my point. And AMLO is a quintessential limit of populism in the specificity of the Mexican state. But I think he's performed even worse than many who had already skepticism. And the real weakness of the Mexican left was although you can understand it, given the desperate situation that Mexico was in, you can understand the temptation. I think it was a real mistake to put all the cards into AMLO, which extraordinary parts of the Mexican left did. And I think there's total disarray now as to how to move forward. I am very pessimistic on all fronts in that situation.
Well, isn't that a wonderful way to end this panel? Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Right, Jeff? Hopefully.
Sure.
Okay. Well, miigwech, thank you. Gracias. Merci. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. Thank you again to Elise and the organizers of Historical Materialism to allow us to have this virtual space with you today, and for the recording that we also hope people will enjoy. And thanks very much to the panelists. I look forward to reading your papers in print form. Please do send them along, either before or after you've submitted them. I'm happy to look at them. So everybody have a great rest of the conference. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Thanks, Elise. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.